A cry in the storm. The sky over Wyoming cracked open with a fury that rattled even the roots of the Wind River Range. Lightning speared down through bruised clouds, and thunder followed like cannon fire, shaking the valley with a violence that felt personal. Zane Northwood pulled his oilskin duster tighter, shoulders hunched against the relentless rain as he urged his gelding through the sodden trail. The horse protested with every step, its hooves slipping in mud that swallowed the sound of their passing. He should have stayed back at the cabin when the clouds first massed that morning, rolling over the peaks like a warning. But the cattle had scattered during the night, spooked by wolves maybe, or something worse, and Zane couldn't stomach the thought of leaving them to fend for themselves. The path narrowed as it dipped toward a draw trees bending against the wind like supplicants, and that was when he heard it soft, nearly drowned beneath the wind and water, but unmistakably human. A cry, faint, raw, and trembling. He reined in hard. The gelding snorted, eyes-wide legs dancing dangerously on the slick earth. Zane scanned the storm-lit slope, rain stinging his face like glass. Again the sound came closer this time. Not a scream, not quite but a cry, born from something deeper than pain. Something like surrender. "Hello," he called, voice raised over the storm. "Who's there?" Another flash of lightning streaked across the dark sky, momentarily casting the slope in silver light. That was when he saw her, a slumped figure near a fallen pine soaked to the bone. A bonnet clung to tangled hair, her dress plastered to her limbs by rain. She didn't move, didn't lift her head until he dismounted and knelt beside her, boots sinking deep into the soaked ground. Her eyes met his wild with fear, but holding something else too. Something deeper, something broken. "Do not touch me," she said, her voice a whisper between thunderclaps. But her body shivered violently. "I will not hurt you," Zane said low and steady, his hands, visible, his tone coaxing. "But you'll freeze if you stay out here." Shelter and silence. She didn't respond, not with words, but she didn't flinch when he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders either. Carefully, he slid his arms beneath her. She was lighter than she should have been and lifted her off the ground. The horse stepped nervously as Zane mounted, cradling her against him as best he could. She didn't resist, but she didn't lean into him either. It was like holding a ghost that hadn't yet decided whether to stay or go. They rode slowly, the rain sheeting down harder as they climbed the ridge. The trail was slick, the air so cold it bit at exposed skin. Zane kept one arm around her and the other firm on the reins. She stayed quiet, pressed against his chest like she was trying to disappear into the folds of his coat. Not once did she speak, nor sob, nor shiver again, as if she had burned out everything left in her body except the ability to be carried. The cabin came into view at last, just a one-room shack set against the trees, smoke long since blown from the chimney. Zane kicked the door open with a boot and stepped inside the warmth from the last fire already lost to the storm's breath. He laid her gently on the cot near the hearth and knelt to strike a match. She watched him without moving, eyes following his hands like a trapped animal, uncertain of the next blow. "Fire first," he muttered, voice low. The match caught, and golden light flickered to life, throwing long shadows across the rough-hewn walls. She hadn't spoken since the trail hadn't moved except to curl in on herself. Then, just as the fire crackled into life, she spoke again. "I didn't know where else to go." Her voice was quieter than before, nearly lost in the snap of flame. Zane turned. Her face was pale lips tinged blue. "You don't have to explain," he said gently. "Let's get you warm. Names and ghosts." The fire cast a soft glow now stretching across the room in amber light. Zane peeled off his wet shirt and grabbed a wool blanket from the cedar chest, offering it to her without fanfare. She hesitated just long enough to remind him she hadn't yet decided if he was safe, then wrapped it tightly around herself. She stared at him like she was waiting for him to become someone else. But he didn't move, just stood there, quiet and still. "I'm Zane Northwood," he said, voice, even not asking for hers. She nodded once, staring into the fire. "Delia Monroe. Where were you headed?" "Delia," she looked down into the tin cup he offered, lukewarm water, the best he could manage for now. "Nowhere," she said finally. "I was running." Zane sat across from her, keeping a careful distance, close enough to share the heat from the hearth, far enough not to crowd her. From what Delia's fingers tightened around the cup, her knuckles whitening. "My husband died last winter," she said. "Then the ranch hands left. The bank came, said the land was not mine. I had nowhere left." She paused, eyes on the flickering shadows. "So I walked. The storm caught me near the ridge." Zane studied her face. Fine bones beneath grime and weariness, sadness etched into her mouth in lines too deep for someone her age. "You said was," he said gently. "Means you're alone now." Delia nodded barely. "I have no one." Zane leaned back, the firelight catching in his eyes. His voice was quieter this time, but certain. "You do now." Shared silence and the weight of grief. Outside the wind howled like it carried ghosts. Inside the fire snapped and hissed as it ate through the kindling. Zane sat cross-legged near the hearth, the wet of his trousers steaming in the warmth. Delia sipped slowly from the tin cup, her hands shaking just enough to make the water ripple. She hadn't said another word since admitting she had no one. Zane didn't press her. He knew better than to ask a woman broken by winter and lost to speak before she was ready. Some grief was too tangled to unravel in a single evening. The cabin was small but dry, and he kept it tidy out of habit more than pride. Tools hung in their places along the wall. A small shelf held coffee beans and a Bible whose spine had cracked long ago. He rose to his feet and pulled a second blanket from the trunk. Tossing it gently onto the pallet he set up across the room from the cot. She followed his movements with her eyes, but said nothing. The space between them was thick with unsaid things, but not hostile. Not anymore. It was the silence of two people who understood there were wounds words couldn't reach. He banked the fire, then lay down on his side of the room, arms folded behind his head. She remained upright on the cot for a while, still wrapped in his coat. Her gaze lost somewhere in the middle distance. The firelight played across her features, sharp cheekbones, wind-burned lips, and the heavy shadow beneath her eyes. Finally, she eased back against the pillow and pulled the blanket up to her chin. "Why are you up here alone?" she asked, her voice nearly lost beneath the creak of wind through the roof beams. Zane didn't open his eyes. "Used to be a ranch foreman near Laramie. Lost my wife in childbirth 3 winters back. Couldn't face the town after that. So I came here." The fire popped and she was quiet again. But after a long minute she said softly, "I'm sorry." He nodded once. "Me too." A whisper in the dark. Zane thought she'd fallen asleep. The hush had settled around them in a way that made it feel like even the storm was catching its breath. He was just beginning to let go of the day when her voice came again, almost inaudible. Thank you for stopping. He opened his eyes, watching the shadows dance across the wooden ceiling. Her words hung in the air, fragile and honest, the kind that didn't come easy. He didn't answer right away, didn't want to say something that might crack the moment wide open. "I heard you cry," he said after a pause, voice steady. "That's all." But they both knew it wasn't. He'd heard more than a cry. He'd heard something that called to him, something buried so deep in the sound it didn't need words to be understood. And she knew it too. She didn't reply. But the silence between them shifted, became less about fear, more about recognition. Two people, both carrying losses too heavy to name, had crossed paths in the middle of nowhere beneath a sky that had long since stopped offering comfort. And somehow, for reasons neither could explain, they were still here. Still breathing, still warming beside the same fire. Outside, the storm rolled on, but it had lost its rage. Thunder drifted away into the hills like a warning that had finally given up. Inside, something small but real had taken its place, the morning after. By dawn, the storm had bled itself into the soil. The clouds were lifting in slow, tattered swaths, revealing a ridge softened by mist and silver light. Zane stepped out early, the door creaking on its hinge, and crouched near the woodpile. The air smelled of pine and ash, and the earth beneath his boots gave slightly no longer frozen, but still damp with memory. Inside, Delia stirred. She stood barefoot near the stove, hair dry now but untamed, half-braided and already falling loose. She wore the same dress, but it hung a little differently now, weighted by sleep, by warmth, by something not quite peace but close. She hadn't asked for anything, yet she'd stirred the coals back to life and warmed the skillet without a word. When he stepped inside, the scent of bacon hung in the air. "You didn't have to do that," he said, setting the armful of wood beside the hearth. "I know," she replied without turning, "but I used your blanket." Seemed fair. Zane poured water into the basin and washed the grime from his hands. "You always settle debts that fast, I try," she said, flipping the bacon once. "But I've got more owing than I can ever pay off." He leaned against the wall, watching her shoulders tight, like she was waiting for the world to remind her she didn't belong. Her movements were practiced but guarded, as if even here, surrounded by silence and pine, she was ready for something to snap. "You planning to keep running?" he asked. Delia turned, lifting the skillet and scraping the bacon onto 2 tin plates. There's nowhere left to run. Ledger books, and the memory of belonging. They sat across from each other at the small pine-wood table, the scent of bacon fading as the fire settled into its embers. Delia's fingers cradled the edge of the tin plate, though her food sat mostly untouched now. Her eyes had wandered toward the saddlebag she'd left by the door the night before, a sagging thing worn and scuffed, its leather straps stretched thin from long use. Zane followed her gaze. "What's in it?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was soft. "Ledger books. My husband kept records. Every calf born, every bag of feed hauled. He believed in order, thought if we wrote it down we could hold it." "Did it work?" She shook her head. "No, we still lost it." Zane reached for his cup and took a slow drink of coffee, letting the quiet do what it needed to. He didn't push, didn't pry. "You keep them because they matter," he said finally, "or because you don't know what to do without them." Delia's thumb brushed the rim of her plate. Somebody should remember he tried. Even if it didn't hold. Even if he couldn't save the land. Zane let that truth settle. He understood the weight of memory, what it meant to carry something that had slipped through your fingers, yet refused to be discarded. "Then keep them," he said. She looked at him, not with gratitude exactly, but with something quieter, a kind of recognition, like maybe he was someone who didn't need things explained to understand them. Labor and grace. Later that morning, the mist had begun to lift, thinning into streaks that drifted over the low sweep of grassland. Delia stepped onto the porch, arms folded tight around her middle. She stood still for a long time, watching the way the trees leaned toward the rising light, as if trying to remember something soft. Zane joined her, pulling a clean shirt over his head, the scent of fire and morning clinging to the air between them. "I've got fences down," he said, eyes scanning the horizon. "Cattle scattered some." She turned slightly. "I can help." Zane arched a brow, not in challenge but in surprise. "You know how we had hands," she said. "But when they left, it was just me." He nodded. "You ride?" "Not pretty," she said, "but I stay on." They saddled 2 horses, his gelding and the smaller roan he kept for supplies. Delia mounted without assistance, hitching her skirt above her ankles, boots planted firm in the stirrups. Her movements weren't fluid, but they were capable. She didn't hesitate. They rode side by side through the low hills, where frost still clung to the shaded patches of grass. The air smelled of wet pine-thawed soil and something older beneath it all. He pointed out a broken rail near the creek bed, and before he could dismount, she was already on the ground, lifting the post with both hands, while he steadied the crossbeam. They worked like that for hours, barely speaking. The rhythm of it, lift-a-line hammer, filled the space where words didn't need to go. She didn't flinch from the weight, didn't shrink from the mud. When a calf bawled in the distance, she paused, turned toward the sound and narrowed her eyes like she already knew what needed doing. By late afternoon, they'd mended 3 rails and coaxed 3 calves back through the gate, acknowledgement in the quiet. As they finished setting the last rail, Zane watched her brush damp strands of hair from her face with the back of her hand. A streak of dirt crossed her cheek like war paint. Her breath was steady. Shoulders, squared hands, marked by work. She didn't ask if she'd done well, didn't need to. "You're not afraid of the work," he said. "I was born to it," Delia replied simply. "Folks think women can't manage land, but we do it all the time. Just not always loud enough to be noticed." He chuckled, a quiet sound that came from somewhere deep. "You're being noticed now." She looked over at him then, and something moved in her eyes. Not a smile, not yet, but the shadow of one. She tilted her head slightly. "You don't ask questions like other men. Maybe I'm not like other men." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. That counted for something. The sun dipped low behind the hills as they rode back, casting long amber shadows across the fields. At the cabin, Delia unsaddled her horse with practiced hands, hung the bridle with care, and moved inside without waiting to be told. She sat by the window, letting her hair down, combing it out with quiet care. The fire flickered low again, and Zane poured water into the kettle. "You planning to sleep inside again tonight?" he asked. Delia didn't turn. "Unless you'd rather I didn't." He took a step closer, but not too close. "I'd rather you did." This time she turned slowly, her gaze steady. "Then I will." Outside, the wind picked up again, but it sounded different now. Less like a threat, more like a lullaby winding through the trees. Embers of a new beginning. That night passed in long, soft stretches of silence. No words were exchanged after she agreed to stay, but something had settled between them different from the strained quiet of survival. Zane banked the fire, low, rolled out his blanket on the pallet across the room, and lay back with his hands behind his head. Delia curled beneath his coat on the cot. She didn't speak, but she didn't tremble like before either. The wind outside drifted across the cabin walls without fury, now whispering like it was tired of its own voice. By morning, a thin frost had etched itself onto the windows, delicate as lace. Zane stepped out before the first light reached the ridge. His breath fogged the cold air as he hauled oats to the lean-to. When he came back inside, Delia was already awake, seated at the small table pencil, in hand a sheet of rough paper before her. The kettle was warm, the skillet greased. "Didn't hear you get up," he said, setting his gloves near the stove rail to dry. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, eyes not leaving the paper. "Your floor holds every creak like it's got secrets." He poured water into the basin and glanced over at what she was drawing. "You writing?" "Trying to remember the layout of our pasture back in Ellen," she said, tapping the paper lightly. "I used to walk every fence line with my husband before the frost came. Thought maybe if I drew it out, I could hold on to it longer." Zane didn't say anything right away. He moved slowly, letting the water warm on the stove before speaking again. Then he sat across from her elbows, resting lightly on the table. "You plan to try for another piece of land?" She shrugged. "I don't know what I'd do with it, but I don't like the thought of forgetting how it felt. To belong somewhere." He nodded. "There's land out past the second ridge. Belongs to no one, if you're willing to fight rock and cold for it." Delia looked up, really looked at him. "I've fought worse." Zane gave a short nod. "Then maybe you'd take a look with me when the sun's higher." She folded the paper, tucking it carefully into her pocket, like it meant more than words. "I'd like that. A ridge and a ribbon of land." They set out after breakfast, walking the trail on foot. The frost was melting slowly beneath their boots, leaving the ground slick and smelling of thawed pine and old leaves. Zane led the way, stopping here and there to point out the way the soil shifted where elk passed through and where the snowmelt pooled in spring. Delia walked beside him in silence, listening. Not just to him, but to the ground itself, to the wind, to the rhythm of this quiet life. When they reached the top of the ridge, she stopped short and drew in a slow breath. Below them stretched a hollow, long and open-edged with pines, and bathed in golden light. A creek wound through the middle silver in the morning sun. Wild rye grew along the banks, and the place smelled untouched, like no one had bothered to ask it for anything in a long time. "I didn't expect it to be so open," she said. "Most folks pass it by," Zane replied. "Too much work to clear." Delia crouched, brushing her fingers through a clump of grass. "It's good earth. Settles different when it's been left alone a while." Zane watched her. Her hand pressed gently into the soil like she was greeting an old friend. Land remembers who's kind to it. She looked over her shoulder, eyes curious. "You sound like you've talked to it yourself." "I've listened," he said, voice quiet, but sure. They lingered there through the better part of midday, tracing the edges of the hollow, marking places where the wind blew hardest and where the ground shifted with each season. She asked questions, practical ones, about water rights, fencing tree lines. He answered them with the certainty of a man who'd learned things the long way, without pride, without pretense. At the far end of the clearing, they sat together on a fallen log, sharing a strip of dried venison from his coat pocket. Overhead, a hawk circled high and slow. "What holds?" Delia's voice came after a long silence, steady but low. "My mother died when I was 16. We buried her under the cottonwoods behind the barn." Zane stayed still, letting the moment find its shape. "After that, I stopped talking so much. My husband never seemed to mind. He liked quiet." She paused. He didn't interrupt. "I don't miss him the way folks think I should. But I miss the steadiness. Knowing someone would rise when I did. Sleep when I lay down. That kind of rhythm." Zane shifted elbows on his knees. Steadiness matters more than most people give it credit for. Delia looked at him, not searching for anything, just seeing him. "I've known men who talk about promises and men who just keep them. You strike me as the second kind." He gave a small nod. "I don't make many, but I don't break what few I do." She nodded once, and they sat in companionable stillness. The creek murmured below them, and the warmth of the sun pressed gently on their backs. By the time the sky began to shift toward pink, they'd made their way back down to the cabin. Delia gathered pine kindling without being asked, sleeves rolled high. Zane checked the horses, speaking to them in a low voice. When he returned, she was already stirring flour in a bowl apron tied at the back, hair knotted in a strip of muslin. "You sure you want to cook again?" he asked, leaning against the door frame. "I don't like sitting idle," she said. "Besides, I make better biscuits than I do conversation." Zane smiled faintly. "We'll test that theory." A map made of hurt. That evening the fire burned low and steady, casting soft amber light that flickered against the cabin walls. Delia sat cross-legged on the braided rug near the hearth, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her skirt tucked beneath her legs. She stitched the edge of a curtain with careful, practiced fingers. Across the room, Zane sat with his boots off, mending the strap of his saddlebag. The leather was cracked with time, and the stitching had come loose during their ride to the ridge. His hands moved with the quiet confidence of a man who'd patched more things than he'd thrown away. She spoke without looking up. "You think we're meant to be alone after we lose someone?" He paused needle halfway through the leather. For a while, he said nothing. The fire cracked. The wind brushed faintly at the eaves. "I think," he began slowly, "some people find their way back, if they're willing to let the hurt be part of the map." Delia's needle stopped. She sat still for a moment, watching the firelight play across the stones. "And if they're not, then they stay lost longer," he said. "But not always forever." She turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes were tired, but no longer hollow. "You still believe in a future?" she asked softly. Zane set down the saddlebag, and the thread rubbed his palms together, then looked up. "I believe in today. The rest can grow from that." Delia looked at the floor, then back at him. Her voice, when it came, was hesitant but honest. "Would it trouble you much if I stayed a while longer?" His answer was quiet. "Sure. Wouldn't trouble me one bit." Her shoulders eased just enough to be noticed, and for the first time since she'd crossed his threshold, she tucked both feet beneath herself like she belonged to the ground she sat on. Seeds of home. By the time the last snow melted from the north-facing slope, the creek had swollen with spring melt tumbling fast over the rocks below the ridge. The earth was damp, dark, and full of promise. the kind of promise that didn't need words to be believed in. Delia stood in the clearing beside the cabin, sleeves rolled to the elbow skirt, hem pinned up past her boots. A stick was clutched in her hand, its end sharpened to a point. She dragged it through the soil in straight furrows, eyes tracking each line with a quiet intensity. Her brow was furrowed, not with frustration, but focus and expression that came not from effort, but from purpose. Zane leaned against the doorframe of the cabin, a sack of seed corn resting against his hip. He watched her with a kind of reverence, like one watches a hawk ride the wind or a sunrise stretch across snow-dusted pines. "You've got a straight line," he called out. She glanced at him, brushing sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. "Used to tie string between stakes, but I've learned to trust my eye." Zane stepped forward, dropping to a crouch beside her. "Mind if I walk it with you?" She handed him the stick. "Go on, then. Let's see if your hand's as steady as your talk." They worked in tandem, her marking, him following behind, pressing the toe of his boot into the soil to firm the line. The rhythm came easy, not hurried, not strained, just honest work. And something about that made the silence between them feel rich, like soil just turned under. After a while, Delia broke the quiet. "That hollow you showed me, it stays dry through spring." Mostly Zane dusted off his palms, nodding. "Holds a little water near the creek now and again, but it drains quick." She looked toward the ridge, her eyes distant. "If I built a lean-to there, I'd need to fell pine. Maybe use some of those trunks near the east fence." Zane paused, one hand resting on his thigh. "That a thought or a plan? I don't make plans without thinking first." He stood brushing dirt from his trousers. "Then we'll see to it. I've got tools, and the saw's sharp." She looked at him, then down at the rows they'd just carved into the earth. "You'd help me with that?" Zane nodded. "If you mean to stay, it's no longer just yours to build. The kind that holds." She took a step back, then letting her gaze move across the field, the rise of the ridge, the outline of the cabin behind them. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "I'd like to make something that doesn't disappear when the weather turns." Zane didn't hesitate. He reached for the sack of corn and placed it in her hands. "Then we plant." They dropped seeds one by one, fingers working in practiced silence. One kernel every few inches, the way his father had taught him. The sun climbed higher as they worked, and their shadows stretched long across the furrows. When the sack was empty, Delia leaned on the hoe, wiping her brow. Zane stepped back, studying the rows. "You've got a way of moving like you've always belonged to this land." "I don't belong to much," she said, "but I know how to listen." Later, they knelt at the creek sleeves, pushed up water, cold enough to sting. Delia cupped her hands beneath the current, letting it run clean between her fingers. Zane sat back, watching the way her palms curled inward, not fragile, but capable. "Weathered. Real." "I never asked," he said. "What you'd have done if I hadn't come along." She let the water fall from her hands. "I would have walked till my feet gave out, maybe found a tree to sleep under." He looked at her, brow furrowed. "You don't talk like someone who gives up easy." "I don't," she said. "But I was close." The willows behind them rustled in the breeze, and the creek whispered over stone. "You found something steadier than what you had?" he asked. Delia turned to him, eyes unreadable. "I think I found someone who hears quiet things." Zane looked at her, then really looked. "That's not something I ever set out to be." She smiled, not wide, but real. "It's still what you are." They walked back slowly, boots leaving prints in the softened earth. Inside the cabin smelled of ash and warm bread. The shape of a life. The cabin smelled of warm bread and wood smoke by the time they returned. Delia pulled a fresh loaf from the oven and set it on the table without fanfare. She broke it in half and handed Zane a piece, the crust still steaming. He accepted it with a small nod, sitting near the window as the last light of day spilled across the floor in long gold ribbons. She didn't sit right away. She busied her hands, smoothing the cloth on the table, checking the kettle. But Zane waited, and after a few moments, she lowered herself into the chair across from him. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked, not looking directly at him. Zane tore a small piece of bread, chewing slowly before replying. "I think about what holds," he said. "What doesn't wash out when the storm hits." She nodded slowly, her eyes settling on the plate between them. "And if something holds, you keep it." She sat back, folding her hands in her lap. "Then maybe I'll build that lean-to, and maybe I won't leave it behind come winter." He held her gaze across the table. "I'd like that." She didn't smile exactly, but her face softened as if something inside her had eased. For the first time, she didn't seem like someone passing through. She looked like someone returning not to a place, but to a steadiness she'd once believed was lost to her. The steadiness after storm. The days stretched longer with each sunrise. The snow that once iced the ridges had receded into memory, and in its place came the scent of thawed pine-tilled soil and distant wild flowers. Delia moved through the days with sleeves rolled high and boots caked in dust. She raked the clearing near the cabin with measured strokes, the hem of her skirt dark with labor. Her hands were lined now, not with age, but with use. Her face, still solemn, carried something settled. Not joy, not yet, but steadiness. The kind that comes after a storm passes and you're still standing. Zane returned from checking the west gate with the coil of fence wire slung over one shoulder. He paused at the edge of the pines, watching her work in the clearing. The way she moved spoke of purpose, not urgency. She wasn't trying to outrun anything anymore. She was tending to something that might last. The west gate's holding he called approaching. I walked it to the gulch. She looked up, adjusting the rake between her hands. "I boiled some willow bark this morning. Your shoulder's been tight since we hauled that timber." Zane set the wire down near the barn and dusted off his hands. He raised an eyebrow. "You watching me that close?" Delia straightened. "I watch what matters." He stepped a little closer, the light behind him warm and low. "You always speak that plain." She turned toward him, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. "No, but I've lived enough silence to know when truth the better offering." He studied her a long moment, and something in him eased. "I've been thinking," he said. "That land above the creek, it's yours if you want it. Not an offer, but a life." Delia blinked, caught off guard. "And what would you keep?" Zane glanced toward the cabin, then back at her. "The rest, and maybe a place beside me, if you've got use for it." The wind shifted, lifting strands of her hair, but she let them fall without brushing them back. "You're not offering charity. I'm offering a life." Her voice came slow, thoughtful. "I didn't come here looking for one." "I know," he said. "But I found something, didn't I?" "You did." She stepped toward him, deliberate, steady, until there was no space left between them. Her fingers reached for his palm, calloused to calloused, and he didn't pull away. "I won't run again," she whispered. "You don't have to." They stood there beneath the vast Wyoming sky, the last light folding across their shoulders like a benediction. No promises were spoken, but something stronger passed between them. Not declared, but lived. Something that couldn't be broken by wind or snow. That night they sat by the hearth with the fire low and the hush of evening wrapped around them like a shawl. Her chair was pulled close to his, her shawl slipping from one shoulder as she mended a hem. He smoothed a new handle onto his drawer knife, his fingers moving in slow, familiar circles. The air smelled of pine pitch and bread baked earlier that morning. Delia didn't look up when she said, "I want to raise chickens again, not for profit." Zane didn't pause. "Just for the steadiness of it. I'll build you a coop," he said. She nodded, eyes still on the muslin. "And maybe a small fence for a garden. I've got seeds put aside from before," he replied. "I'll dig the trench." She smiled, just enough to crease her cheek. "You always answer like that." No hesitation. Zane looked up. "I know what I want." Delia turned to him fully, the needle still in her lap. "Then say it." He didn't rush. He reached for her hand, warm, rough, and steady beneath his own. "I want this," he said. "You and me. A life that doesn't ask more than what we can give. Shared work. Quiet nights. A roof we both belong to." She looked at him long and true, and whatever she'd been holding back finally loosened. "Then it's yours," she whispered. "I'm yours." A vow. Beneath the cottonwoods. 2 weeks later, under the wide sky and beside the creek where cottonwoods rooted deep and sure, Zane and Delia said nothing, and it was enough. No preacher, no congregation, no vows etched in stone. Just the two of them standing where the water ran clear over worn rocks, their hands joined their futures entwined in something older than paper. Zane had carved 2 rings from shed antler, smooth and pale as bone. Delia wore hers on a leather cord around her neck, his fit snug on the smallest finger of his left hand, and he never once took it off. That summer the land bloomed like it had waited for them. The garden rose in neat rows behind the cabin, bean squash, corn, and wildflowers that had taken root between the furrows as if to remind them life didn't always come planned. The coop filled with hens that clucked and scratched like they'd always belonged. Together they built a lean-to, not for storage but for shade in the hottest hours of the day, a place where they sat back to back and talked in low tones about what needed mending next. By fall, the corn stood tall. Delia canned peaches and beans in mason jars that lined the cabin shelves like small amber suns. Zane stacked wood high along the north wall, enough for 2 winters if needed. They didn't speak of the past, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer held them hostage. In the hush of twilight when the work was done, they reached for each other without words, a hand across the table, a touch at the shoulder, the steadiness of presence. The winter that didn't hurt. When winter came again, it came heavy with snow, but gentle in spirit. The world turned white, yes, and the wind howled against the walls as it always had. But inside the cabin, the warmth never faltered. They moved through the long nights, like clockwork, her head against his shoulder, his thumb tracing quiet arcs along her wrist. They didn't say love aloud. It wasn't the sort of thing that needed naming. It was there in every shared pot of coffee, every quiet glance across a row of growing crops, every night they chose to fall asleep side by side. Their pasts stayed with them, but not sharply anymore. They became softened, shapes, shadows, smoothed by the rhythm of new days. Delia no longer jumped at thunder. Zane no longer dreamed of empty cribs and screaming wind. Together, they built something neither of them had dared believe could last. There were hard days, broken fences, sick livestock mornings when snow buried the world outside. But those days didn't break them. They'd known worse, and now they faced those trials not as separate souls stitched together by necessity, but as partners with calloused hands and steady hearts. Their love wasn't lit like fire, it was laid like stone. One day after another, until the foundation held. The cabin that held. The years slipped past, not in a rush, but in quiet rhythms. Spring after spring, Zane and Delia walked the edges of their field planting seeds with fingers grown familiar to the soil. The chickens clucked their cycles. The garden leaned into bloom, then into harvest, and the creek faithful as the breath between them never ran dry. In that cabin built from solitude but mended with company, they lived without fear of the wind. Where it once howled, it now whispered through the eaves like an old friend that knew it had lost its power to terrify. Inside, the wood creaked with the memory of their steps, and the curtains Delia once stitched held back the dawn light just enough to let sleep linger. They grew older, as all things do. Her hands grew stiffer, his back bowed with years, but even as time wore down the edges of their bodies, it never managed to dull the core of what they'd made. A home, not a house, not a shelter of convenience, a home that held through sorrow, through silence, through the unremarkable miracle of shared days. In the final paragraph of their unspoken vows, they remained what they had always been, two souls who chose day after day not to leave. And in that quiet corner of Wyoming where the wind once tore and now only whispered, Zane and Delia lived out their days in peace. Side by side, never once alone again.